Hello, and welcome to the Canticlear Podcast, where we accompany our recordings of the Psalms with conversations about the rich wisdom of the Psalter, the storied history of Psalm chant, and the place of both in our congregations today. My name is Brittany Hurd, and my first guest today is Todd Granger, a medical doctor with a master's in church history and a voracious reader besides. Todd has over 45 years of experience as a church musician. He currently serves as the catechist for adults at Holy Trinity Anglican Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where we worshiped together for around 5 years, but became friends much more quickly. Along with his wife, Jill, he actually was part of the quartet that led the chant of Psalm 67 at my recent wedding. Because, of course, whether singing or speaking, Todd is one of my favorite people to listen to. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. So let's just dive right in. I think a lot of people have this misconception, perhaps, of chant as epitomized by that Monty Python bit with the monks kind of wandering around, droning on and thwacking themselves in the head with the Bible.
Domine.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Whack. Yeah,
exactly. Yes. Can you tell us what chant is, why maybe it's not that exactly, and why it's not boring or scary?
Yeah, so chant is simply reciting a text on a tone or musical note or notes, but it's simply reciting. It's not singing. It's not a melodic sort of recitation in the way that we would think about, most songs now. Songs or hymns now. Whether secular or religious. The closest thing to it in other music is probably a recitative from an oratorio, for example. Similar to chant, I don't know that there's any relationship between the two, except that they both occur in the Western Church. It's interesting about the scariness. Some people are sort of put off by it. I wouldn't know how to do it. The truth of the matter is, every one of us has chanted something. When we talk about people talking in a sing-song voice, or kids say nanny, nanny, boo, boo, or make up other words that I'm going to tell on you, that's chanting. You're reciting that text on a tone. You haven't made a song out of it. You're just reciting this text, and you've sort of given it more power by putting it to music, by putting it to notes. For one thing, you can project it better, but it's adding some sort of emphasis to it that it doesn't have otherwise. Some people in the Protestant world are put off by it, particularly sort of later evangelical Protestantism, are put off by it because of its associations with the Roman Catholic Church. And so it sort of is fed by the stereotype that Monty Python has, which is tremendously funny, honestly, but it sort of feeds that, it's the Catholic Church, sort of this idea of it's a relic of medievalism, and that's not how people are supposed to sing. I remember my mother, who actually now loves chant. I remember sitting at the piano. I had a spinet piano in my bedroom when I was in high school, and I was sitting at it, and it was, I think, after I'd been introduced to more liturgical worship at a church in Boston when I'd spent a summer there. And I grew up in a Baptist household. I had the Methodist hymnal. Those who are of my generation and who were Methodist might remember this old red Methodist hymnal, but it had some chants in it that probably most Methodist churches never use. But I was chanting through some of them, and Mom said something like, "You sound like a monk. Just why are you doing that?" So
there are worse things to sound like. I think
absolutely worse things to sound like, and I think it's just because it sounded strange to her or something, but. So there's absolutely nothing weird about it. Christians have been singing this way we don't really know how long. I'll kind of hit on that at the end with something I want to leave folks with. But, at least since the probably 3rd or 4th century, certainly in the East, and likely in the Christian West around the same time, at least since then. And it's helpful to remember that, of course, we know that Pliny the Younger writes about Christians singing hymns to Christ as to a God. And Paul speaks of singing hymns and psalms. And we have to remember the hymns were not strophic at the time. And the psalms they would have been the psalms of the Psalter, of the Hebrew and then the Greek, the Septuagint Psalter. So these are not strophic, lined out, A, B, A, B kinds of sections of poetry. They're more free verse things, which means that they would have been chanted. All of these things would have been in some chant. Now, it's unlikely there was a system of chant at the time, but Christians have been
can you
singing
talk about
chant
that a little?
since
Pardon. Can you talk about that a little, about how how chant maybe developed in the church? Because there are different kinds of chant. The one that I use on the channel is Anglican chant, but there are several different kinds before that. Could you give us an idea about those?
Yeah, so in the West, I'll limit myself mostly to the West, because the Eastern churches have a history of chant, whether it's the Copts or the Iraqis or the Armenians or the Iranians with the Nestorians, or the Byzantines, and then from them the Russians and other Slavs in Eastern Europe. But the origins are similar. So we think most of the chant, even the Western church that we have now, probably had its origins in Syria, or other parts of the similar local nearby parts of the Levant, and made its way across. In fact, there's in the West, the earliest form of chant, or the earliest form of chant that we know of, in Rome, and there may have been more than a couple of forms in Rome, but the one that is called Roman chant is actually influenced by chant from Syria, when Syrian emigres came to southern Italy and to Rome and to Sicily. In around about the 3rd, 4th century, and they introduced some of their chant tradition to Rome. So in the West, there developed Roman chant, which again, there's local and regional variation, but Roman chant comes to be the chant associated with the Roman Church. And while many people, certainly again North American Protestants, think of Mediterranean Catholicism as being sort of exuberant and bright and just lots going on, the truth is the church at Rome was extremely conservative, very staid. They were, the Romans were stiff upper lip people, and we're talking about the Romans. It's really the Germanic tribes who introduced this sort of exuberant stuff in the Mediterranean. But so you had Roman chant, and there was another form of chant, and actually I should even back up some. There were rites, which were the way that the liturgy was ordered. Everyone had a basic general, form, but the liturgy would take different forms according to these rites. So one is the Roman or Latin rite, which comes to be predominant in the West. By the Reformation, by the time of the Reformations, it is with local variations called usages, it was the dominant form. There's another form which still exists actually in Milan, called the Ambrosian Rite, which is named for St. Ambrose, who of course was the bishop who baptized St. Augustine of Hippo, and who actually wrote a number of hymns that he used to teach people the Catholic faith out of Arianism, the Christological heresy. And it bears his name. Now, whether it goes back to him or not, it bears his name. And there's a particular kind of chant that's associated with the Ambrosian Rite. The Ambrosian Rite is considered by some church historians or liturgiologists to be sort of a subset of something called the Gallican rites, which were a sort of general, kind of vague, but described a sort of general character to the Christian liturgy and to chant as it developed in Gallia, hence Gallican, in modern-day France. What's modern-day France?
Right.
This would have been during the Merovingian period. So after Clovis, the king of the Franks, had come in and basically taken over, became a Christian, up until the time of Charlemagne, when the Carolingian period begins. But during the Merovingian period, this Gallican rite started. Now, the Gallican rite is, whether owing to the Franks and other Germanic peoples like the Burgundians and Visigoths who were in France, or the native Romano-Celts, was a lot more florid and much more prolix. I mean, long hymns. You see the same thing in some of the older Celtic rites, or long prayers, really long prolix prayers. The epitome of the Roman prayer is the collect, which is an attribution, a petition, and a conclusion. So Roman prayers tend to be shorter, less prolix, and their chant tended to be less florid. Gallican chant was more florid. Come back to that in a moment. The final major rite in the West was called the Mozarabic rite, or Mozarabic. It's named for the Mozarabs, who were Christians who lived under Muslim rule in Iberia after the Moors had invaded Spain in the early 8th century. So we're talking, early 8th century into the 14th, 15th century. that we have Mozarabs. The Christians, the Iberian Christians who were Visigoths, were pushed, or at least their rule was pushed up to just the upper northeastern or northwestern and north central edge, as well as where the Basques were. And so there was this large group of people. Now, with the Reconquista, then the Latin Rite, the Roman Rite, spread more through Spain, became Spain and Portugal, the kingdoms in Iberia. And now the Mozarabic Rite is used only in, I think it's a single chapel in Zaragoza. But it still lives, and the Mozarabic Rite is much more florid in its chant than the Roman Rite. I've actually heard the Eucharist chanted, the Sursum Corda, etc., chanted with Mozarabic. It's more difficult. In fact,
And when you say florid, do you mean
it has a lot more
also
melodramatic lines? There are a lot more notes. There are more, but I mean, there's still that basic. It's reciting. And then you have these sort of ornaments going on in different places. It would also be a little less understandable, right? So as we move, potentially, yeah. But depending on how well the person is enunciating the Latin that he's singing. What we know as Gregorian chant or Plainsong, even though it bears the name of St. Gregory the Great, doesn't actually go back to St. Gregory the Great. What they would have been using in the Roman Church during his time, late 6th, early 7th century, would be Roman chant, the old Roman chant. And there are still some examples of old Roman chant that persist in the Liber Usualis, the book of sort of chants and other liturgical texts that the Roman Church has. Various editions updated because of changes in liturgy, particularly post-Vatican II. But in the 8th century, there was sort of a fusion that occurred of Gallican chant and Roman chant that produced what comes to be called Gregorian chant or Plainsong.
Oh, so cool.
What we sing now is kind of an 8th century fusion, or an evolution out of an 8th century fusion of Gallican and Roman chant.
Very cool. So then Anglican chant, how did that develop?
Yeah, Anglican chant's interesting because the Church of England, of course, in the Church of England, when the Reformation, the English Reformation occurs in the 16th century, they're using Plainsong. I mean, there's also a lot of polyphony because in the meantime, you've had polyphonic music grow up, but basically the basis of it still is Plainsong. And of the Reformation churches, the two groups who preserve Plainsong in their liturgy are the Lutheran churches and the Church of England. I'm not sure whether the Lutheran churches used it in psalmody. They do use it for the text of the Mass, though, and the text of the daily office. In fact, there are a lot of sort of historically informed kind of period performance recordings now by people like the Gabrieli or groups like the Gabrieli Consort, who've recorded Christmas Day Mass as it may have been celebrated in this church in Germany where Michael Pretorius was. And it includes, I mean, you would recognize it. You would recognize what the pastor is chanting. But those persisted. However, because of this problem that you hit on, could the people have understood it? Thomas Cranmer, the reforming Archbishop of Canterbury, insisted, by the time the Reformation is really going during the reign of Edward VI, he insisted only one note per syllable. So you have these long melismatic lines with one syllable stretched out over multiple notes. The English were particularly famous for this in their polyphony. In fact, it was called jubilating, where you'd sing this one syllable over just measures and measures of a melisma. The English composers were famous for it, to the point that you'd lose the sense of what the text was. And it's one of the reforms.
So you get this idea that Cranmer is like, all right, guys, that's enough.
That's enough. In fact, the same thing happens at the Council of Trent with the Roman Church. Is they say, okay, guys, that's enough. We're going to have simpler polyphony. Now they don't say one syllable per note. There's an apocryphal legend that Palestrina saved polyphony because Pope Marcellus wanted to say no to any polyphony for kind of Cranmerian reasons from a Roman perspective, and Palestrina, the great composer, went in and he saved polyphony. That's almost certainly not true. But it did tone down.
Being multiple melodic lines.
Melodic lines, right? Going over long melismatic, you're seeing the same syllable over several notes. But so Cranmer says one note, one syllable, one note. And the English composer John Merbeck who was an organist, chorister, composed music for the Book of Common Prayer, the first Book of Common Prayer, 1549, that does that. But he uses the Plainsong settings for the Song of Mary, the Magnificat, for the Nunc Dimittis, the Song of Simeon, for the Gloria in Excelsis, for the Sanctus. He's using the English versions of those from the Book of Common Prayer, but he's using the Plainsong tones that have been associated with those. Now, where does Anglican chant come from? There was a tradition that grew up in the late Middle Ages of a practice called fa burdening. It's also sometimes called, in a more Frenchified way, faux bourdon, Fauxbourdon, or faburden, Faburden. Now, it sounds like, and I actually thought originally that what it means is this false melody, all right, faux bourdon, false melody. It's not. What it simply refers to is the fa of the scale. So do, re, mi, fa. So what would happen with a chant is if the chant were ba-da-ba-da-dum, then you would have one voice doing that, and you'd have other voices singing a fourth higher on the fa. So you get this sort of harmonized chant. There might also be people singing at the fifth, so you get so you get this. They're all singing the same thing, but they're different in different intervals to each other, so they create harmony by doing that. And so that practice comes to be called fa burdening, and that could be done just on the fly. That could be improvised by monks and nuns. But it could also be composed, and there are composers who do fa burden versions of the various psalm tones. Anglican chant begins with that. It begins with English through composed fa burden versions of the psalm tones, and then and it remains that. Although mostly they're still singing Plainsong through the 16th into the 17th century. In fact, there is a great website. I can't exactly tell you what it is, but NC State has it. I think it was a joint venture between the engineering school or maybe architecture school and I think maybe the English department, of creating the oral environment of the old St. Paul's Cathedral in London. That is the one that burned in the fire of 1666 before the current St. Paul's was built. And they've reconstructed this oral environment. And they actually have services. They have recorded services in which they have a choir singing. I think one of the services is morning. They have a morning prayer, an evening prayer, and a Holy Communion service, in which they also even have sermons from people who had been at St. Paul's at the time, like John Donne. And mostly the songs are being sung to Plainsong, to the traditional Plainsong tones. With the Restoration, after the Civil War and the Commonwealth and the Interregnum, they've killed Charles I. Once Charles II comes back, bishops come back, Book of Common Prayer, now in a new edition of 1662, comes back, then really that's when Anglican chant takes off. So you begin to see much more composition of Anglican chant in the late 17th century, and then it really begins to flourish in the 18th into the 19th and 20th centuries. And to the day.
And when you listen to some recordings like the King's College Choir of Cambridge, those are beautiful and also sound very difficult. Can you explain a bit how simplified Anglican chant came about?
Yeah. So simplified Anglican chant, I actually just learned this recently. So it's meant more for congregations to be able to sing it. And it was actually, its introduction into the Anglican world came from the organist of the Episcopal Cathedral in Connecticut, I think in Hartford, who was visiting Notre Dame and heard them singing in this way. Now, I don't think they were calling it simplified Anglican chant, but they were singing four-part harmonized chant that had been simplified. And my guess is it probably bore some relationship to what's called Gelino psalmody, which is a sort of modern simplified psalmody that came from France, Gelino, and is meant to facilitate congregational singing of the psalms. So simplified Anglican chant, and I'll go through an example of that in a sec. Simplified Anglican chant typically moves only one place per half line, per half verse. It only moves in one place, whereas both Plainsong and Anglican chant move otherwise. Now, I've been mentioning Psalm. I've been mentioning psalm tones. So
Hmm.
psalm tones have some variation across the Western Church. And again, now we're talking about the Western Church, not the Church in the East. So we're talking, Poland and Hungary westward, to as much as any of those churches evangelized and missionized across the world. There are generally 8 psalm tones. There is also a tone that doesn't fall into any of those 8 called the tonus peregrinus, which is Latin for wandering tone. That actually turns out to be maybe the most interesting of any of these for historical reasons. I'll leave you on the cliffhanger that hopefully we'll get at the end. But there are 8 tones.
Those who watch my videos will note that the Psalm 114, which is the last one that I recorded,
Sorry, I'm standing up to switch over to a different speaker. This one seems to have on me.
are you still there? Oh, now I'm not hearing you at all.
Alert. Your meeting will end in 10 minutes. Need more time? Upgrade now. Button. Not now. Button. Display Joe Martin's video. Audio muted. 3-bar signal strength. Minimize meeting. Button.
Oh.
10. Button. Core.
There we go. You should hear me now.
Uh-huh. Gotcha.
Yeah, for some reason it muted me when I changed the speaker.
Mm.
Yeah, anyway, you were saying about Psalm 114. I'm sorry I missed it.
Oh, yeah. Psalm 114, as listeners to my channel will have noted, it is from the tone, the Peregrinus tone, though it was the setting itself was written by David Hurd. As far as I know, no relation, but yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, the 8 tones, and the tones also are related to modes. Now this is different. So there are musical modes from which our modern day minor and major keys come. Modal music shows up in a lot of folk music as well, even like some Sacred Harp shape note singing. Some of those are Amazing Grace in its original form is sort of a New Britain is a modal tune, so those are the musical modes: Lydian, Mixolydian, Phrygian, Aeolian, etc. So there are also modes that are called ecclesiastical modes, and they are for antiphons. So antiphons being originally non-biblical texts that would be sung before and after a biblical text, like a psalm. Later, antiphons also came to be taken from biblical text or interwoven with non-scriptural text and biblical text, again, bracketing psalms. The antiphons are the antiphons and modes are much more elaborate than the psalm tones are. The psalm tones are basically meant for reciting. They're not meant to be elaborate. They're meant for a group of people to be able to sing them, a group of monks, a group of nuns, or a group of lay people, if that had been going on, to be able to sing them and to sing them well, without sort of everything becoming this muddle. But the antiphon was more complex. And the modes are named by the ending note, weirdly, the ending note of the antiphon. So there are 8 modes, and so we have 8 tones, each of which is connected with one of the modes. And that's their numbers, their numbering is for that. So what it's meant is for each of the psalm tones to have this seamless moving into the antiphon or moving out of the antiphon. And so tone 1 would be sung with mode 1 antiphons.
Okay.
So each psalm came to be associated with its own tone, or not its own tone, but with one of the 8 tones. Now, an additional slight complication is that in fact, most of the tones have different endings. So, for example, tone 8, which is, so that's the first ending. Here's the second ending. Now, you wouldn't sing these in the same psalm. You would sing one psalm according to one tone with one ending, but different psalms or other texts to tone 8 might have a different ending associated with them.
Okay.
But all of them will feed seamlessly. All of them will end on pretty much the same note, and they'll feed into that mode 8 antiphon. which again, there aren't just 8 antiphons. There are a bunch of antiphons. It's just it's a matter of systematizing it, so that it's easier to remember. And yeah.
Right. Very cool.
So
Now we only have a
where they
short
came
time
from.
left
Now,
before Zoom kicks us off here. So there was something you wanted to show us?
well, just quickly to go through a couple of texts according to different ways of singing it. So this will be the Venite, Psalm 95, just a couple of verses sung to, I think this is tone 4. I'm sorry, it's tone 2. I'm not sure which ending, but so, and I'll do a little accompaniment because these are usually sung unaccompanied, but they can be accompanied by organ or piano. Oh, come, let us sing unto the Lord. Let us heartily rejoice in the strength of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving and show ourselves glad in him with psalms. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. So that's just a taste of the Plainsong for that. And here's Anglican Chant. So this is a chant by Maurice Green, who is an important English organist of the 18th century. Oh, come, let us sing. Oh, come, let us sing unto the Lord. Let us heartily rejoice in the strength of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving and show ourselves glad in him with psalms. So a little trickier, which means that some congregations might be able to do that. I think most congregations could sing Plainsong. In fact, I've heard congregations sing Plainsong. Anglican chant full on is a little difficult for a congregation. Yeah. Because you have to know, well, we could talk about pointing later, but so here it is to Simplified Anglican. Compare how it's different from what I just did. Oh, come, let us sing unto the Lord. Let us heartily rejoice in the strength of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving and show ourselves glad in him with psalms. So yeah, much easier for a congregation to grasp, for sure. Yep, and a congregation can grab onto that, and even you can sing it with in parts too. Yeah. So especially as you get used to it, right? Yeah. So pointing, that is knowing where to move, basically depends on counting backward to stressed syllables. It'll vary a little according to the psalm tone that the psalm is sung to. In Anglican chant, it's always the penultimate stressed syllable that you move on for the first half line. For the second half line, you move on the antepenultimate stressed syllable, that is the one before the next to last. And stressed syllable meaning not just a syllable, but stressed syllable, because any spoken language, including English, has stresses. As for primary and secondary stresses in a line, and so you move where it stresses at those times. Sure. So, and these are all very stereotyped, which is not to say they're boring, because there's an incredible variety of the sounds of these tones and Anglican chants, but they're all stereotyped as to when they move, right, because it needs to be predictable. Good. Well, I think that Zoom is going to kick us off shortly. So do you have any recommendations for where people might be able to read more about Psalm chant or the history of it in the church, things like this? Yeah, you could just go on the internet. I mean, there are certainly texts I could direct people to, but you needn't go to a library. You could just go online, just Google Psalm chanting, and find a good sort of ecclesiastical site that's going to have useful information, one that's not written for church musicians either. And there are any number of them out there. The Psalms, we're particularly talking about chanting Psalms here, but of course entire services can be sung or chanted, but chanting the Psalm, I mean, that's what the Psalms are meant to be, is sung. Right. And chant permits you to sing the actual text. Right. I'm reminded that Bonhoeffer was that we sing together because we're praying the same words together, and what we're praying is the word. And that's particularly true when we're singing the Psalms or any of the biblical canticles. Song of Mary, the Song of Simeon.
Mhm.
It permits us to say all of those together in a way that
In one
adds more
voice.
emphasis. The other thing about Plainsong is you begin to listen to each other breathing. You become very aware of the people around you.
How
And
cool.
it's important to listen when that person next to you breathes. You know that you start breathing together and singing together. This particularly happens with a small group who sing, or monks and nuns, I'm sure, who are doing that together. It gives this feeling of it's sort of a physiological form of koinonia, of communion that you're sharing, and hopefully you're also sharing in the communion of the Holy Spirit while you're singing these things. The final thing I'll leave you with is Psalm 114, and as you said, Tonus Peregrinus, which you'd already sung for them. And one of the interesting things about that tone is that it goes back a long way. In pretty much, it is the chant to which that psalm is sung in the Western Church. Even if you look in Anglican chant psalters like the Psalter for St. Paul's Cathedral and others, there are settings of the Tonus Peregrinus as Anglican chant in those. So that's kind of interesting because it harkens back to the original way that Anglican chant formed out of Plainsong chant. I don't think that earlier been. So with the recovery of Plainsong and Anglicanism, I didn't mention that at all, but the recovery of Plainsong and Anglicanism in the 19th century as a result of the Anglo-Catholic movement, and then further into the 20th century, other than the use of Merbeck's original mid-16th century settings, then we saw a lot more of that sort of recovery. And again, this is an interesting text because it goes way back. In fact, the synagogue cantillation for Psalm 114 is the same tune.
What is a cantillation?
So it's basically a chant. It's a more ornamented chant that the cantor will sing.
Okay.
I think I'd read in one source that it was Sephardic, but I think it's across the Jewish world, both Sephardim and Ashkenazim. And so that means that we have a chant tone that has a common ancestor that's older than the split between Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity.
Oh, wow.
So, and some scholars on that basis think, and there's not that much extant evidence about this because we don't have extant evidence about the way the Psalms were sung in the temple or anything, is that in fact it is from the first century. It may in fact be a tune in its Hebrew form. What is it? Beshet Israel, or Betset Israel, Yisrael is the psalm. This may be a tune that Jesus and the apostles would have known for Psalm 114.
Oh, wow, that is
and it's a
really
particularly
cool.
important psalm because remember in the synoptic gospel accounts of the Lord's Supper, and they sang a psalm and went out to the Mount of Olives. Well, the psalms that were sung at the end of the Passover meal, though we don't know the structure of that, we can't assume it had the same structure as the later Seder did. But the psalms that have been sung since time, for millennia after that meal are the Hallel psalms, of which 114 is one.
Okay. Wow.
So, it makes sense that this central group of psalms for Jewish practice, both late Second Temple Jewish practice and then subsequently for rabbinical Jewish practice, that are associated with the Passover, we'd be using a tone for it in Christianity with, again, a similar sort of centrality for Passover, both in the sense of the Passover lamb being this figure of Jesus as the substitute for our sins, the way that death passes over us, as well as the further Christianization of that is Jesus passing from death to life. That's all caught up in the Easter Vigil. So all those Passover, Paschal, Exodus stuff in the Great Vigil of Easter, for example, which also goes back, to whenever, at least to the 3rd century. And it's possible, maybe is this a psalm tone or the cantillation for Betset Yisrael that was used in the temple? I mean, are we hearing something? Because as the book of Acts says that a lot of the priests and Levites became Christians, became members of or followers of Jesus.
And I mean, whether it is or not, I think it touches on one of the things that I love so much about psalm chant is that it connects us to the traditions of the church universal across time, not only across geography, as we're tend to think of it. Yeah.
Which is a very important. Again, it gets in a more than local sense at the sort of koinonia that Bonhoeffer and others have remarked on that singing does. It brings you together in that. And no, the psalmody sung in various forms, including Plainsong, has of course been sort of reintroduced to the wider Protestant world in the later 20th century. And the whole and the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches and Lightheart and Jordan and others have sort of introduced it more into a tradition, a Reformation tradition, in which psalmody has generally been metrical psalmody or subsequently read psalmody. Now, to be fair, in your average parish church in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries in Anglicanism is not going to be chanting psalms. They're going to be reading them at the daily office. But in cathedrals and collegiate churches, colleges, they'll be chanted at first to Plainsong, and then to that evolution out of Plainsong that becomes Anglican chant. For congregations who are considering it, probably the easiest way to get in is Simplified Anglican chant.
Sure.
The next easiest is Plainsong. The introduction of either one requires sensitivity to how much people can take in, how much they can learn from it. One of the pitfalls is too much too soon approach, and you don't want to put people off. A lot depends on having a strong singer, a strong cantor, or a strong group of choristers to lead it, and strong accompaniment, who are sensitive to, gosh, I'm an organist, and I really would like to play this sort of complex harmony with this plain song. Well, maybe what you need to do is just play the Plainsong in octaves for the first, several times until they really know it, and then you can start livening it up for them with the oral
ornamenting it a bit. Sure.
Actually, yeah.
What sort of now? So you're at Holy Trinity Anglican there in Chapel Hill, and I want to say it was only in the last couple of years that the congregation there began chanting the Psalms on Sunday rather than either reading or singing them in a metrical way. What have y'all found to be both the delights and perhaps even some challenges of introducing that and making it part of the practice there on a Sunday?
Yeah. I mean, I've been primarily involved in that as a congregant. I had done some early introduction several years ago when I was still the parish musician of Simplified Anglican chant. But I don't know about any pitfalls. I mean, for me as a congregant, I love singing them. They're sung well. I don't know if there have been any pitfalls, but the joy has been that they've been sung well. And again, the fact that you're singing the Word of God. Bonhoeffer, I keep coming back to Bonhoeffer, but in his the Prayer Book of the Bible, which is about the Psalms, he talks about we're praying to God with God's own words in the Psalms. Yeah. It's much like using the Lord's Prayer. You're praying in God's own words when you pray the Psalm, and there's just power in that. I mean, when you remember, this is the Psalms are Jesus' prayer book too, right? I mean, these are his prayers to the Father. In fact, of course, understood Christologically, they are his prayers to the Father. Sure. This is the Word speaking.
Augustine approves of this message.
So exactly. I mean, we're all Augustinians in the West, right?
That's right.
Reformed or Roman or Lutheran or whatever, we're all Augustinians. Well, most of us. Those of us who are doing it right are Augustinians.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, there's just joy in singing the Psalms. Now, there are other ways that have been introduced or were introduced in the late 20th century of singing the Psalms too, and that was in a responsorial manner. Now, that didn't begin in the late 20th century. That's an older tradition as well, but it's sort of introduced then. So you can do responsorial psalms with congregation with Plainsong. So this is where the congregation would sing a refrain or antiphon. They're generally called refrains because they're sung not only at the beginning and end of the psalm, they're sung between the verses. They're sung as refrains every, 2 verses or so. And there will be a plainsong refrain, and a cantor or a small schola of singers will sing the plainsong tone. Now it's kind of a backward thing because the refrains are almost always more complex than the psalm tone. And the psalm tone is really the thing. It's almost like the cantor should sing the refrain and the people should sing the psalm just based on the simple character of but what it means is that it's composed. They know exactly where the syllables are going. There's no pointing necessary.
And in this antiphon, you said it's the same line over and over, right? It's the same text.
Exactly. They're singing. It is a refrain. They're singing the same thing. So
actually,
go ahead.
On our honeymoon, my husband and I visited a church that did this exactly with, I think, 3 of the songs throughout. One of them was a psalm. I don't think the other ones were, but yeah.
And then there's a variant of that, which is where doesn't use plain psalm, but uses a sung, it's like a song. The refrain is like a song, and then usually the verses are then chanted by a cantor or a group of singers in between, and so this refrain will be sung like that. In fact, one of the settings for our excuse me, turn my phone back on. One of the settings that we've done for the gospel acclamation between the epistle and the gospel at Holy Trinity is your word it's a piece of one of the verses of Psalm 119. Your word is a lantern to my feet and a light unto my path. And that's the refrain that we sing as the gospel is being processed, and the cantor will sing a verse for that, and then we repeat the refrain. So we've used that sort of thing too, and that's another good way to do it because it's also in a form that people are familiar with. People are familiar with singing short snatches of melody, and it might be another way to get people listening to chant at the same time that they're with what they're singing. It sounds like a song, and the chant is being used for speaking this text on a tone. So wonderful.
Well, thanks. This has been awesome, I think I can say. One last question, more of a fun question. What have you been listening to of late?
What I have been listening to is a lot of French Baroque music.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm very much an aficionado. My temperament really likes 17th century music, which tends to be, at the same time, they can be really magnificent. And also there's a certain kind of, there's a depth to it, and also almost this kind of melancholia, especially English music of the time. The secular music I'm thinking of more than the church music. Okay. Not that I'm particularly melancholy, but I have sort of an autumnal, wintry disposition, and so
there you go.
Speaks more to me, I think. And then when I feel lighter, I listen to Italian Baroque music. So, and at any time, I listen to Bach. But
of course, Bach is good for all times.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as just to follow up on your question about where should people go, so basically just hitting into a search. An internet search engine, how to sing the Psalms or how to chant the Psalms would bring up any number of good sites, and it'll be pretty quickly apparent which ones are good and which ones aren't. As far as for what I was saying about the about Psalm 114, it's worthwhile for people to check out on YouTube. Just type in Psalm 114. There is a group I'm not sure where they are. They may be in Boston. The Zamir is their name, chorale, who have an interesting, at one of their concerts, which is recorded on YouTube, not great recording, but they actually sing the verses, all of the verses of Psalm 114, first in Hebrew with the Jewish tone, cantillation, and then in Latin with Tonus Peregrinus. And it's
very cool.
Very apparent with that.
Yeah, I'm about to look that up right now.
These two things have the same mother. It is very clear. Much like Judaism, Rabbinical Judaism, Christianity have the same mother, Second Temple Judaism. So it's a fascinating thing. There's also the San Antonio vocal arts ensemble have a setting of Betset Yisrael, Psalm 114, that's just in the Hebrew, but they are doing it in a way that they've, I will say, imagined, because we don't know, but is using a lot of other instruments, including sort of kind of not exactly shofars, but trumpets, cornets, probably, cow horn trumpets, from the Renaissance, and various percussion and harps, and singing this cantillation, singing the verses to this cantillation, so that they're giving this sense of, maybe this is what it sounded like in the temple, except that women are also singing, which of course wouldn't have been the case in the temple. But is this part of, are we getting a glimpse of what David bequeathed to the temple and to the later church when he did his, as Peter Leinhart says, he revolutionized the worship of Israel by introducing song to it. I'm not saying that the tune goes back to David, but just so they have an interesting imagining of how that and it's really well sung. But the one with the chorale is just great. It's fantastic because of that setting them side by side.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope that our viewers will join us in the future as well. Thanks, Todd. Have a good one.
Okay. Bye.